Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we return to the controversial communities of Sheikh Jarrah and Shimon HaTzadik. Because following a highly publicized conflict in the neighborhood and on the heels of decades of court battles, Israel's Supreme Court once again delaying the order to evict and instead offering a sort of compromise. Justice Yitzhak Amit saying this compromise will give us breathing room for a good many years until either the land is properly regulated or there is peace. Now, the idea is that the Palestinian tenants will get to choose members of their families to receive renewed protected tenant status. And it would be considered a first-generation protection, meaning that they could pass the status under certain conditions to their children. And this, in turn, would prevent any eviction efforts for at least several more decades. The catch is that they pay a meager 1,500 shekels, or less than $500 per year, to the land-owning group, a sum far below market value for even a single month's rent in the area. The landowners, represented by Nahalat Shimon Ltd., however, rejecting the compromise, demanding that the residents recognize the Jewish group's ownership. And the Palestinian residents, for their part, accepting the court's conditions but refusing to recognize the Israeli owners. So, what will be of Sheikh Jarrah, and how will the consequences ripple out? Joining to discuss, Executive Director of Honest Reporting Daniel Pomerantz and Danny Seideman, founder and CEO of Terrestrial Jerusalem. Thank you both so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you both with me. Now, Daniel Pomerantz, I'm going to start with you. What are your initial reactions to the court ruling? Do you think that the court capitulated in some way, or did the right thing, or maybe just kicked the can down the road to the next judges panel?
Well, I'll tell you, there's an excellent article in Times of Israel by Haviv Redikur a few days ago explaining that this situation is tremendously complex with a lot of different interests, and years of mismanagement on all sides have brought us to a point where it's very difficult for any solution to really be a good one. But as they say, sometimes perfect is the enemy of good. So how can we get to a good solution? The underlying principle here is that prior to 1948, there were Jews living in these homes. And then in 1948, Jordan invaded and took these homes and gave them to Palestinians who at the time had not yet started calling themselves Palestinians. The national identity emerged over time later than that. Some Jews living in these and other homes were evicted. Some were actually massacred or driven out. It was a horrible situation for everybody. And now we find that we have a group of people who feel each other's pain. There are people on both the Jewish side and the Palestinian side who recognize that there's no easy answer to this. This is a place that used to belong to Jews. This is a place that currently belongs to Palestinians. I give the example, if I went back to my grandmother's home in Poland from before the Holocaust, well, there are people living there now, and those people have been living there for generations. So what is the right thing to do? In a way, this is a microcosm for the entire West Bank. It's a situation in which a lot of sides experience a lot of pain, and the only solution that will work is if all sides can come together and recognize that and bring about a compromise that recognizes the need for families to have continuity and to live where they are, while also recognizing that there were other families there who were indeed mistreated. This is an important point because in much of the conversation in the media throughout the world, we never encounter the idea that Jews were anywhere before somebody else. And yet, this is a case in point in which that was very much the case. And that lends a level of complexity that makes this much more difficult to solve than a mere good guy, bad guy kind of analysis.
All right, so in short, do you agree? Do you support the court's proposed compromise?
Well, I think what is positive about the compromise is that it allows the current residents to continue living there, but by asking them to pay rent, it implicitly acknowledges that ownership belongs to someone else. It acknowledges the historical pain and historical difficulty that everyone has endured. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of merit to the compromise. One thing we discovered recently, there was an article about this in JNS back in May, that this compromise came up several years ago, and there were Palestinian families who were prepared to accept it. And apparently the Palestinian Authority government threatened them quite viciously, took control of their legal counsel and wouldn't allow them to instruct their lawyers. And under penalty of, or under fear of retribution and without being able to control their lawyers, they were forced to not accept that settlement. And now it's unclear. We hear the lawyers speaking for the Palestinian residents, but we have no way of knowing whether that's really what the Palestinian residents believe. And to me, this is the fundamental underlying concept behind much of the conflict between Jews and Palestinians. There are a lot of good people out there who want to make peace and want to find a way to acknowledge each other's pain. And there are a lot of terror organizations who are working very hard and investing tremendous resources in actively trying to stop peace.
All right. Well, I want to bring. So first of all, Daniel, thank you so much for your response. Danny Seideman, I want to bring you into the conversation. You've been waiting very patiently. How do you respond to this court ruling and to Daniel Pomerantz's assertions?
Actually, I'm quite fascinated by the court's handling of this. And I've been working on this for the past several days. And I'm doing something which is quite dangerous for attorneys to do, and that's try to understand what's the court up to? What's the subtext? What are they telling us? And I've been reading and rereading the court record, and I think it's fascinating. Number one, the court made an effort to create a parallel universe. Let's keep history out of this. Let's keep ideology out of this. The court put the burden on the press, but it was the press and the international community. No, I'm not going to give you a break because then you'll go out there and you'll be influenced by. They wanted to neutralize any extraneous influences. That's lesson number one. This is extremely personal as an interpretation, but the subtext that I read is this shouldn't come to a verdict. Don't force us to make a verdict. The British did something very wise. In 1924, they created the Order in Council, which maintains that holy sites and religious matters are not judiciable before a court of law. It's not appropriate. There are views in the Talmud that are compatible with this. In Baba Metzia, Lo Charva Yerushalayim Ela Shedanu Badin Torah. Jerusalem was destroyed because of the overzealous application of the letter of the law, more or less. And the subtext is both sides. Don't force us to pick up a pen and write a verdict. This is a matter that should never have come before a court of law. It should have been handled by the government. The government, and a number of governments have not been terribly courageous about this. And we are exploring the possibility of a settlement. The court impressed me with how well prepared they were and addressing the gaps between the two sides. And the question of ownership, I think, is more pretext than a cause of difference. No, the Palestinians will not accept a deal which explicitly acknowledges the ownership. And the court has come up with ideas of how to handle that. I think they're good ideas. One, the settler corporation will assert and point out their ownership. The Palestinians will assert their protected tenancy without formally making any declarations. The Palestinians will waive their claims to ownership in all circumstances except when the property will be registered in due time. So there is a sliver of maintaining their claim. And finally, the court hasn't gone into the details, but say, we have ways through third parties which we think will be acceptable to both sides.
Daniel, go ahead.
The story we hear in the press is that Jews are taking homes from Palestinians. So first of all, we should be clear, we're talking about 4 homes. So when they use the word mass evictions, that means more than one. It doesn't mean that they're evicting hundreds of people or large neighborhoods. And also, this is not an example. The phrases we're hearing in the media is all of Israel is Sheikh Jarrah, Tel Aviv is Sheikh Jarrah. The idea that Israel is founded on taking homes from Palestinians. This is such a lost opportunity for the world to hear the truth. And that truth is that there are people who have shared interests and shared pain, people who were living in similar places at similar times and have to find a difficult compromise in order to move ahead with life. That's how you get out of the ideology. This conflict that we saw last May, where Hamas was firing thousands of rockets, presumably in order to protect Sheikh Jarrah, when in fact what they were doing was firing exactly at that area. This is exactly the sort of thing we want to avoid. And my question for Danny is, you're following this case very closely, and you seem to be intimately knowledgeable about the court. Do you believe that the court is acting in the best interest of the situation, or do you think that they are being swayed to a great extent by the possibility of violence, influence from outside countries, and influence of the press? Because if that's the case, while we certainly want to avoid violence, we don't want to create a situation, a precedent, in which violence ends up influencing the decisions of our courts.
A very good question. In 1948, in Jerusalem, the war was carried out on the streets. There were approximately 2,000 Jews who were displaced in the war, lost their homes. Most of them were in the Jewish quarter of the old city, but some were in Sheikh Jarrah, in two areas, Shimon HaTzadik and across the street in Umarun, the Georgian quarter. There were between 20 and 30,000 Palestinians who also were displaced by the war. One city, one war, and by the way, on both sides, the Haganah and the British told the residents of Sheikh Jarrah to leave. The British and the Palestinian leadership told the Palestinians to leave. It was part expulsion, part willingly, and there were atrocities on both sides. There was the Hadassah convoy in Sheikh Jarrah 3 days after the massacre in Deir Yassin. After the war in 1967, Israeli legislation allows Jews to recover their property. It does not allow Palestinians to recover their property. Now, for me, from my perspective, Jerusalem is occupied territory, East Jerusalem. And the forceful displacement of a civilian population under occupation is a war crime that I hope we will not commit. Transferring your population to occupied territory is in violation of international law. I know that the Israeli Supreme Court cannot rule according to international law. If they think that East Jerusalem is occupied, they have to put their keys on the table, as they say in Hebrew, and not to be Supreme Court justices. They have to rule in accordance with Israeli law, and I think that they are doing the optimum in doing that. However, a situation in which you have one war, 1948, two peoples, on both sides people are displaced, and one people and they're living under the same legal system. Palestinians may not return to their homes, and Jews, not the Jews who live there, can return to homes they've never lived in. Having one legal system, allow me to finish one sentence.
You're making a false and absolutely absurd comparison, because let me point out that Jews are not right now returning to their homes in Egypt or in Syria or in Yemen or in Iraq or in Iran or in Libya or in Lebanon. And there are some 800,000 Jews who have suffered that fate and have not been able to return to any of those places. The comparison is utterly false and utterly senseless.
Living in one city, one legal system that is applied in one way for one national collective, the Palestinians, and another way to the Jews, is a place that Israel does not want to go.
Daniel, are you referring?
A word
Mr. Seidemann,
don't
I'm
want to
sorry, are you referring to the
invoke the
1970
A-word.
property law? If you're referring to the 1970 property law, which Israel enacted in order to reclaim certain properties that were taken by the Jordanian custodianship, that law was equally applied to Arabs and Jews. Any and all transfers of the deeds that the Jordanian government transferred the deeds to Palestinians living in those areas, and Israel recognized those deeds. So it's disingenuous to say that the law is racist in one way or the other.
Can you point out one property that was owned by Jews in which the ownership was recognized? That's nonsense. The absentee property law, which applies in Israel,
But that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Of course it wasn't given. But Danny, of course the law didn't really benefit the Jews in this case, because other than with Sheikh Jarrah, Jordan didn't transfer any properties to Jews.
The right of return to ancestral home is reserved to the Jews and denied to the Palestinians.
But that has nothing to do with the property law.
That is not something that Israel wants to do.
But immigration law and this property law are not the same thing.
Anybody who supports a right of return for Jews and denies it to Palestinians is one of the greatest allies of BDS, because decent folks won't be able to support us.
Okay, well, let's take that, Danny. Let's say that Jews and Palestinians should both have the right to return to their ancestral homes. And by the way, I do take issue with your characterization of these homes as never having had Jews live there. The Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood was built in 1865.
You talked about the homes.
Residents.
The homes were built for these people.
Well, I don't know which homes you're speaking of, but there are many homes in the neighborhood that were built in 1865. So if we take your position that everyone should return to their ancestral homes, we no longer have room to discuss a meaningful compromise on Sheikh Jarrah, because this is the ancestral home of Jews who built it and owned it long before Arabs, who at the time didn't even call themselves Palestinians yet, ever came there. So by your logic, this property should go entirely to Jewish families. Now, I don't agree with that, but your logic compels it.
If these properties go to Jewish families, you are kicking the hornet's nest of 1948, and Palestinian families will be entitled to return to Katamon, to Baka, etc. I oppose that, because I am in favor of the right of self-determination of both peoples, and the only way of doing that is to allow each people to have their space. And that means that Palestinian East Jerusalem will be Palestinian and not part of occupied Israel. But
does that include
there is a right of return for one people, there should be a right of return for the other. And if you don't do that...
Does Palestinian East Jerusalem include the Western Wall? Is that a Jewish settlement built on occupied Palestinian land?
Under international law, the old city, including the Western Wall, is occupied territory.
Okay, so let's
I am in favor of a negotiation.
Danny's position is that the Kotel, the Western Wall, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is occupied Jewish settlements on Palestinian land and should be is a violation of international law. When it was built 3,000 years ago, it violated international law, and it should now be given to the Palestinian Authority government. Is that what you're saying? Because that's where your logic leads us.
These claims will be settled in the framework of an agreement, and that agreement provides for modifications of the border, which have been agreed upon in large part in Jerusalem. Under that, the Western Wall will be under Israeli sovereignty, and this will be the crowning achievement of Zionism, recognition of universally, and not by Trump, universally recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and our assuming our rightful place among the family of nations. Throw out the people in Sheikh Jarrah, and that will be a major setback to Zionism. Creating circumstances where Jews and Palestinians have the same rights in this tortured land, including the right of self-determination, that will be the crowning victory of Zionism. There is no greater threat to the Zionist enterprise than perpetual occupation. And occupation is at its most toxic in Sheikh Jarrah. We are talking about thousands of people. They are the first. There are hundreds more in Sheikh Jarrah. There are hundreds more and so on. We have never engaged in
Daniel, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm very sorry to cut you off, Daniel, but you're making a lot of assertions. Many of these families are not up for eviction or population transfer. In fact, the Palestinian population has exploded in East Jerusalem alone. It's not being transferred out. And that's just demographic and census numbers.
I am dealing with facts, and I can give you the precise number of how many eviction proceedings there are in Sheikh Jarrah, how many there are in Harun, how many there are in Batr al-Hawa. I'm not saying that the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are being ethnically cleansed. I'm saying that there are neighborhoods, Silwan, Batr al-Hawa, Harun, and Shimon Tzaddik, where they are being targeted for large-scale displacement in order to be turned over as ideological trinkets to biblically motivated settlers. That's what I'm saying. And the numbers are in the low thousands. They are not the 355,000 Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem.
Well,
Danny, final comments, Daniel.
Danny, thank you for being patient with my high energy interactions. You do make a very good point there, which is there are ideological interests that have gotten involved here and that are working to carry out evictions that aren't in every case quite as altruistic and historically based as the specific ones we were talking about here today. And of course, the way to bring peace and prosperity to this region is for us all to recognize each other's pain and find a way forward. But that includes recognizing the historical Jewish connection internationally, as well as the historical Arab connections in the same place, and finding a solution that may not please everybody, but will work.
All right, Daniel, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Daniel. I have to end it here. Thank you so much.
He was about to agree with me on something.
Thank you both. Thank you. I'm sorry. We'll have to leave it with disagreement, I guess. Thank you so much, Daniel Pomerantz and Daniel Soderman, for joining us. It was my pleasure to host you both. Thank you both so much for your insights.
Thank you.
I'm Aaron Porras. Please tune in next time on Insider for more on everything Israel. If there's a topic that you would like us to cover next, let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook and on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and ILTV.tv channels. Thank you so much. Be well. We'll see you soon.